Angela Davis. Education, Not Incarceration is a co-production of TPT's Minnesota channel and the Givens Foundation for African American Literature. Sponsorship to Givens for this production provided by the Minneapolis Foundation. This lecture by activist, author, and academic Angela Davis was recorded on September 17, 2004 at the Marriott Hotel City Center in Minneapolis.
Our mission at the Foundation is to enrich cultural understanding through programs that celebrate and promote African American literature and writers. And this year's NOMO series has been dedicated to the spirit of my daughter, April Noel Givens, who died earlier this year at the age of 39, very unexpectedly, very suddenly. And April believed in NOMO, which is an African word for the magic power of the word. April believed in literature and reading as one of the main roads to freedom and one of the main ways to express and learn and for our culture to appreciate and grow within our own selves.
Minnesota's prison population has quadrupled in the last 2 decades, and now even prisons built in the 1880s are now double bunked. The Council on Crime and Justice believes that not only must we educate our children so that they do not go to prison, but we must educate those responsible for our sentencing policies and prison system as well. One can see, if that day hasn't already arrived, when most Black Minnesotans' families will be able to say or have to admit that they have a family member, a relative, or a friend in prison. In such a state, people of color wind up the losers, while those that build the prisons and maintain them see their profits bound upwards as a consequence of this new age slavery. Therefore, Professor Davis, you offer and we need a critical dissection of where class, race, gender, and globalization collide in this midst to build more and more prisons. And we dearly would love to have your suggestions on what steps we can take to combat the racism that fuels these invidious practices. It is for these reasons that I am pleased to introduce you to this audience, and it is for these reasons that I asked the audience to join me in welcoming Professor Angela Yvonne Davis.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to say that it is a major honor to participate in the NOMO Forum lecture series, and especially because it honors the memory of April Noel Givens. And I'd like to thank Archie Givens, the president of the Givens Foundation for African American Literature, for having invited me to speak this evening. I'm extremely impressed by the work of the Givens Foundation with its collection at the University of Minnesota, the more than 10,000 rare books and first editions, manuscripts, correspondence, documents that span over 2 centuries of African American history. I want to begin because this series is sponsored by the Givens Foundation, and because of the relationship between the work the foundation does and education, I want to begin by talking a little bit about education. As we know, education has always been historically linked to the quest for liberation, particularly black liberation. Some of the major abolitionist and post-slavery accomplishments continue to live on in what we know as what we now call the historically black colleges and universities. But in general, the state of education in this country is dismal, absolutely dismal. And it seems that this dismal state of education has provoked, for example, Bill Cosby to comment on these problems. First, I think at an event some 4 months ago, marking the 50th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Bill Cosby, of course, has reiterated his critique of poor African Americans and his call for parental responsibility for the education of poor black youth. Now, I don't want to use this opportunity to engage in a debate with Bill Cosby, but I do want to say that I think I understand his frustration. I think I understand his frustration. It has been 50 years since the Supreme Court decision, since the Supreme Court ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. It has been 40 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And those of us who were involved in the struggles for racial equality over the last half of the 20th century had great expectations. We truly believed that equality and justice could be achieved, including, and perhaps in the first place, equal access to education, equal access to jobs. At that time, we could not have foreseen that 30, 40, 50 years later, our communities would appear to be closer to the stranglehold of slavery than ever before. Of course, during the era of slavery, black people were represented as intellectually and morally inferior. Many white people and some black people as well believed that black people were uneducable, or that they were so intellectually lazy that even when they were provided with educational opportunities, they would not have the desire to take advantage of them. And as a matter of fact, the material conditions of slavery, which proscribed education for the overwhelming majority of black people, were such that a self-fulfilling prophecy was created. Now, education, the acquisition of knowledge. The acquisition of knowledge is a discipline. It is a discipline that is not easy to develop, as we all know. How do we explain this 21st century phenomenon that Bill Cosby was attempting to describe? Where are the resources that will persuade most black children, poor black children, and their parents that education is something other than, something more than a stepping stone to monetary gain? Especially when there's so many other competing stepping stones. Sports, the music business, drug trafficking, and this is not, of course, to disparage sports. It's not to disparage music, both of which have an extremely important cultural presence in our communities and increasingly all over the world. This is not even to disparage drug trafficking. because the largest drug traffickers are the transnational pharmaceutical companies that have persuaded us that there is some drug somewhere that will solve all of our problems, whether they be physical or psychological. The point I'm making here is that as long as education is perceived as a commodity that some people can purchase and others cannot afford, the value of acquiring that discipline that allows us to understand ourselves, our communities, our worlds, is seriously demeaned. So when Bill Cosby expresses revulsion at the widespread illiteracy in our communities, he seems to forget, I think, that as important as individual responsibility may be, it cannot change the social barriers that prohibit entire communities from acquiring the values that prioritize education. And so what does it mean to prioritize education when schools in poor Black communities resemble juvenile detention facilities or prisons much more than they resemble places designed to encourage the love of learning? Like Bill Cosby, I am appalled at the state of illiteracy in our communities. But I also know that there are many levels of accountability. Yes, there is individual accountability, but there's also community responsibility. There's also corporate responsibility. There's also governmental responsibility. So as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education, we are compelled to recognize, it seems to me, that the promise of educational equality, indeed the promise of racial equality in the broader sense, has not been fulfilled. As a matter of fact, today, northern schools are even more segregated than southern schools. But what do we do with this information? And I can say that as a person who attended segregated schools during the middle of the 20th century in Birmingham, Alabama, which was at that time considered to be the most segregated city in the South. And one of my classmates, Marcellus Green, is here. He can attest to that as well. As a person who attended segregated schools, I can't support the cynical position that nothing has changed, that nothing has changed as a consequence of struggle, as a consequence of the struggles waged by students and teachers, workers, anti-racist communities, because this would imply that there is nothing we can do to change our future. So this evening, I want us to think about how we can contribute to change. I'd like us to reflect on the fact that indeed a great deal has changed. Not the changes we expected, not the changes we hoped for, but a great deal has changed. When Marvin mentioned the Google hits, I said, okay, this is where we are now. I mean, I didn't know there were, what did you say, 395,000, but this is how we begin to measure significance. That has changed. But I think it may make sense to recall that this year is another anniversary. It's also another major anniversary. It's the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and of freedom summer, the voter registration campaign. Many of the young people who participated in those movements that demanded and indeed enabled the passage of this act were educated in such a way that produced a profound dissatisfaction with the world as it was then. Members of organizations like SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, the Brown Berets, the Young Lords, Asian American organizations, Native American organizations were persuaded. We were persuaded that it was indeed possible to tear down a social system that was based on white supremacy. We were convinced that we could create a new world. But what we did not know then, what we did not know at the time, was that the production of racial equality would require a great deal more than the passage of legislation and the production of Supreme Court decisions. Equality before the law does not by itself produce social equality. And in the frequently quoted words of French writer Anatole France, and I'm quoting, "The law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to beg in the streets, to steal bread, or sleep under a bridge." We might add that people sentenced to jail or prison are equal before the law. They are all subjects who have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, well, you know the mantra, right? The Miranda mantra. The right to due process. As a matter of fact, justice is blind. But the blindness of justice also means that the law cannot grasp the profound differences, the racial differences, the gender differences, the sexual differences, the economic differences that shape people before they appear before the law. And so now there are more than 2 million people who live under some form of confinement under the authority of the federal and or state governments. We're talking about state and federal prisons. We're talking about county jails. We're talking about jails in Indian country. We're talking about youth detention centers. We're talking about immigration detention centers under the authority now of the Department of Homeland Security. Yes, a great deal has changed. We're talking about routine military prisons, and we're also talking about the notorious outlaw military prisons in Iraq, Cuba, and other countries as well. We're talking about the fact that within the US, women constitute the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. And because Black women are disproportionately represented, Black women constitute one of the fastest growing sectors. But we're also talking about the fact that immigrants have joined this group of a rapidly growing population of confined individuals. Over 2 million people. That figure is larger than many countries, many nations in the world. As a matter of fact, you may have read a little bit about Grenada because of Hurricane Ivan. Grenada has a population of just a little over 100,000. And when you think about the fact that the jails and prisons of this country hold 20 times as many people as constitute that entire country. That is extraordinary. Prisons disappear people. They disappear entire populations. Prisons disappear entire communities, especially Black and Latino communities. Now, the disappeared, or in Spanish, desaparecidos, is a term that we tend to associate with the practices of the military junta that seized power in Argentina in 1976. Thousands of people who were suspected of involvement with what the dictatorship labeled, quote, left terrorism, sound familiar? And these were opposition party members, these were labor activists, these were journalists, these were engaged artists, these were teachers, and these were concerned citizens like we all are. All of these people disappeared without a trace. It was later determined that many of them were held captive in a network of secret detention centers where they became anonymous, hooded prisoners subjected to humiliation, sexual coercion, torture, and murder. A quarter of a century later, photographs are taken in a military detention center outside Baghdad and placed in global circulation, thus revealing the ugly details of what probably was the fate of the desaparecidos in Argentina. The victims today, and we continue to follow the unfolding story of Abu Ghraib, are also purported to be terrorists or suspected terrorists, or possible terrorists, which kind of reminds me of the way in which they purged the voting rolls in Florida during the last election, when people's names were removed from the roster of voters because they were suspected or possible felons. Well, there are a lot of connections here. Now, the so-called terrorists, the purported terrorists in Iraq, probably also include labor activists, journalists, cultural workers, teachers, concerned citizens, opposition party members. Only the families and colleagues and friends of these 21st century disappeared can tell us who they really are. But this time, it is not a South American military dictatorship, but rather the military arm of a government that claims to represent the most advanced democracy in the world that is responsible for this repression. The U.S. military detention center located in Guantanamo Bay, which you know about, right? You know about Abu Ghraib. But these are only two of a network of prisons that comprise, as a matter of fact, a secret network of U.S. detention facilities controlled by the U.S. government on territories outside of the country. It is suspected that such facilities may exist on board ships and in countries such as Diego Garcia, Jordan, Pakistan. Many thousands of purported terrorists are held captive in these places where they have probably been subjected to the psychological, physical, and sexual pain we know was inflicted on prisoners in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. Now, what do these names evoke? Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. It seems to me that while they are real environments, and we know what has happened in these environments, they also correspond, they're also imaginary correspondences to the rhetorical violence associated with the Bush administration's war on terror. Now, I said that I probably shouldn't get started talking about our the man who needs to be, and I've seen buttons and slogans, and I think this is really wonderful, the man who needs to be re-defeated, right? So like re-defeat Bush. But in the rhetorical universe that has been created with respect to this war on terror, whoever is labeled a terrorist, whoever is labeled an unlawful combatant, and I think it's important for us particularly to understand the racial dimension of that labeling process, right? Whoever is labeled a terrorist deserves treatment that is in violation of Geneva Conventions and acknowledged human rights standards. But what I would like to focus on this evening is the fact that if Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo recall the fate of the desaparecidos in Argentina, they have also, these places, these sites, these detention facilities, these sites of terror, these sites of sexual coercion and repression have been enabled by techniques of incarceration that characterize normal operations in the vast network of U.S. domestic prisons. Many of the practices we witness are considered normal. And as traumatized as many people may have been by the release of the photographs depicting the physical, psychological, sexual torture of prisoners in Iraq, there has been, it seems to me, a general reluctance to explore the links between what we might call torture in the outfield and torture at home. So what would it mean to consider the relationship between the disappeared who inhabit secret military detention facilities and the disappeared who inhabit state and federal prisons? Paying special attention to the relatively new super maximum security regimes. Lack of human contact, sensory deprivation, conditions that so completely deprive prisoners of agency that they are sometimes compelled to express themselves by throwing their own feces at the agents of control. These super maximum security regimes have taken over everywhere. Virtually every major prison has some unit, whether it's called a segregation unit, administrative segregation, whether it's called a SHU, security housing unit. Virtually every major prison now has one of these units, and there are scores and scores of institutions that are super maximum security facilities. Now, these regimes of incarceration have been seemingly self-generated, with no protest. The justification being that such treatment is needed in order to manage the worst of the worst. This is the language that's used in correctional circles, the worst of the worst. A lot of structural similarities to the way the term terrorist is used, right? Now, it used to be that there was minimum security and there was medium security and there was maximum security. As a matter of fact, minimum implied medium and maximum. But now minimum implies medium, maximum, supermaximum, and who knows what lies beyond the supermaximum. I raise this because these regimes have enormous staying power. They appear to have been self-generated by the process of classification. And anyone who knows anything about prisons knows that classification rules all. It is all about classification. Who gets classified as what? As a matter of fact, I had the opportunity to sit in on a classification hearing at a prison in California. This is not when I was inside myself. I was doing research, right? So and the question was whether the person who was being reclassified should go to a more secure facility, that is to say a 180-degree. It's the whole language, too, that people who are not familiar with the system find flabbergasting, because they were talking about 240-degree facilities, 180-degree facility, and the prisoner was saying, well, I'm not a 180-degree prisoner. I'm a 240-degree. And what does that mean? It means the angle of vision from the guard tower inside the facility, so that the 180-degree angle means that the guards are able to look into every single cell. It's like a panopticon. The 240-degree facility, there are a few cells behind the direct vision of the guard. And so one of the guards was saying, well, you know what happens is that if someone gets incorrectly classified as a 180-degree prisoner, what happens is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He becomes a 180-degree. Anyway, it's mad. It's absolutely mad. And in the state of California, classification is also racial classification. It's also about segregation. It's also about racial segregation. As a matter of fact, in the male prisons, black men are not housed with white men. That is impossible. And what they call Northern Hispanics is a very complicated region. Northern Hispanics and Southern Hispanics. Well, Southern Hispanics can be housed with black people, but not Northern Hispanics. It gets very, very complicated. And you will notice there that black and white prisoners are not allowed to exercise together. If you walk into one of these prisons and you hear the guards screaming, they'll say, I've got 50 African-American prisoners out on the yard. You can't bring any white prisoners until I get them into their cells. So, yeah. So when Iraqi prisoners ask whether the recent evidence of torture furnishes material proof of the kind of democracy the Bush administration is determined to bring to the Middle East. This is a question that deserves to be taken very seriously. And it seems to me, sometimes here in this country we are totally unaware of what is happening in the rest of the world, or we're totally unaware of the representations that circulate throughout the world with respect to the U.S. And so when these images of hooded prisoners began to circulate all over the world, it seems that the images of the economy of images of U.S. democracy shifted in that direction. What does U.S. democracy mean? It means hooded figures being tortured, interestingly, recapitulating the practices of the early prison, the early penitentiary, the penitentiary that was invented by American democracy and offered to the rest of the West, and through the circuits of colonialism, the rest of the world. And this is why imprisonment is the dominant mode of punishment virtually everywhere. It's not because that's the most natural way to address social problems, to address crime, to address the kinds of issues that the prison presumes to address. Now, one of the things we noticed when last spring these images of Abu Ghraib were released was that the notion that the military can provide a site for the production of equality. Colin Powell always talks about the military as the best place to produce racial equality, right? But I started to think about gender equality, because there are all of the debates about who gets to participate in the military, what gender, what sexuality. And when I saw young white women apparently taking pleasure in forcing nude Iraqi men to masturbate, I thought that that was a strange but perhaps very meaningful representation of the military as a site for the production of gender equality. Now, women can participate in torture on a basis of equality with men. In the immediate aftermath of the release of the first images of Abu Ghraib, the French daily newspaper Le Monde published a cartoon, and this cartoon depicted an enormous boot crushing the head of an Iraqi prisoner. It was accompanied by the words, "Répétez démocratie," repeat democracy. Right. Now, if we feel that there's something terribly wrong with the direction of what is represented as democracy by the government in power, if we feel that there's something fundamentally undemocratic, fundamentally anti-democratic about this, about the turn, well, it's not just the last few years, of course. And I don't even want to talk about, what happened before the Bush administration. That's another lecture. But I do want to say that we have to take into serious account what it might mean to acknowledge the repression and torture and sexual coercion that constitute what we might call the underbelly of a particular version of democracy, which has achieved dominance in the world. What version of democracy do we want for the future? And how can we guarantee that technologies of disappearance will cease to exist? This is the context in which I would like us to think about education as a radical alternative to imprisonment. Education, not incarceration. Education, not as the infliction of certain kinds of knowledges on growing minds, but education as the practice of freedom. Education as the practice of freedom. If imprisonment is that state in which basic civil rights are taken away, and that's the meaning of imprisonment, the punishment of prison, the deprivation of basic rights, the deprivation of rights and liberties. So if imprisonment is that state in which basic civil rights are taken away, and of course in this country imprisonment also deprives children, women, men, immigrants, detainees of the war on terror of their basic human rights. This is contrary to international human rights, and this is the context in which we can say education, not incarceration. It seems to me that we need to focus on campaigns to shift resources away from prisons and toward the revitalization of educational institutions. And as we do this, let's keep in mind the relationship between education and freedom, education and democracy. We need a substantive idea of what education is capable of accomplishing in order for it to be a meaningful alternative to incarceration. Now, some of you may be familiar with the campaign to abolish imprisonment, and Marvin asked me to speak about this. The campaign to abolish imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment. Now, this notion of abolition is linked to the abolition of the death penalty. And it's also linked to the historical effort to abolish slavery. As a matter of fact, almost a century and a half after the formal abolition of slavery, the abolition of slavery by law, we are still attempting to abolish the persisting social relations that are rooted in slavery. That is why we have what we call a reparations campaign. And as a matter of fact, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his monumental work, Black Reconstruction, wrote that the abolition of slavery was not truly possible unless it was supplanted by a democratic order. And therefore, Du Bois talked about abolition democracy. It wasn't just about getting rid of slavery. It wasn't just about breaking the chains. It wasn't just about the negative abolition of slavery. It was about remaking the social world. It was about abolition democracy. And it seems to me that the kind of prison abolition that makes most sense, particularly at this moment when the rhetorical defense of democracy by the leaders of the US government often amounts to a defense of torture, a defense of repression, and a defense of the wholesale denial of human rights. It seems to me that we need to talk again about abolition democracy. Education plays a central role here. That is to say, if we think about education not, as I said before, as the imposition of facts and more facts and more facts about the world on growing minds, but rather education as the ability to raise questions about those facts, to develop analyses, to ask why injustice still prevails, and to develop creative strategies to transform the universe. Now, Paulo Freire says, education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. It is our responsibility, it seems, to help create new versions of democracy in which a youthful mistake cannot condemn an African-American child to a life of confinement in juvenile facilities, jails, and prisons. Versions of democracy in which women who have been sexually abused by intimate partners do not have to look forward to the institutionalized sexual abuse inside jails and prisons. Versions of democracy in which the practice of Islam cannot serve as a pretext for incarceration in an immigration detention facility or a military prison where torture and sexual coercion are considered appropriate treatment. And as we think about the particular problems we face with jails and prisons siphoning off resources that ought to belong to schools, let us keep in mind that we're dealing with a larger complex of issues related to the future of democracy in this country and the world. 2 million people in prison. In California, where I'm coming from, in the last couple of decades, the prison population has grown 6 times, from 25,000 to 160,000. As a matter of fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, California ranked first in the country with respect to per capita spending on public education. Now that state ranks near the bottom, which may partially help to explain why California has the largest public prison system in the country, and indeed the largest women's prison in the world. We need to ask what changes in the economy, for example, have facilitated and been facilitated by this soaring population of prisoners. And as a matter of fact, we come to the conclusion that increasing numbers of corporations have a major stake in the continued existence of this punishment industry. Why? Because they are reaping enormous profits. These corporations have acquired a major stake in the continued existence of the punishment industry in a way that recalls the military-industrial complex. And this is why we use the term prison. This is why we refer to the connections that have developed between and among prisons and corporations and government and media as the prison industrial complex, a global prison industrial complex. As a matter of fact, the prison industrial complex has become so huge that it works to perpetuate itself and to continue its own growth, and the raw materials that it uses are this country's youth, and primarily young people of color. Now, if you look at who's inside prison, you discover that many of them are uneducated. As a matter of fact, you've probably heard about illiteracy inside prisons. It seems self-evident that we need a campaign, education, not incarceration. It seems self-evident that more education, quality education, critical education, will go a long way toward reducing a person's chance of going to prison. Our prisons are filled with women and men who, for whatever reason, left school early. But also those who are inside, who participate in education programs, are among the least likely to return to prison. So tell me why so many educational programs have been dismantled, over the last 5 years. Why do prisoners now no longer have access to Pell Grants? Why cannot they devote their time to getting a BA degree, an MA degree, a PhD degree? And students in many poor neighborhoods who have been grossly neglected by educational institutions discover that the very schools they attend in the free world track them not toward college, but toward prison. If they don't get education, they get incarceration. That is to say, if they don't join the military, right? Education, the campaign Education, Not Incarceration, understands that the choices made by individuals, whether students, parents, teachers, or administrators, are limited by larger social and political forces. Now, just very briefly, before I conclude, something about California and our governor, whose budget calls for hikes in tuition and fees for undergraduates. As a matter of fact, and a 40% hike in fees for graduate students. Now, the cost of imprisoning the 161,000 men and women in California correctional facilities is $5.3 billion. $5.3 billion. Since 1983, California has built 23 new prisons, and not a single new University of California campus. There's a campus that they've been talking about opening for years, UC Merced, but budget problems prevent the opening. We just found out that it's not going to open this year, as it didn't open last year or the year before. California builds more prisons, bigger jails, new immigrant detention centers, and has no problem finding the staff to hire for these facilities. And we wonder why there's no money for education. Now, if it were possible to use that $5.3 billion that now gets devoured by the prison system, we could restore the $2 billion in cuts to K through 12 education that we have experienced. We could, and no, hold on, I have a long list here of all the things we can do. We can restore the $1.2 billion in deferred spending for K through 12 education. We can restore the cuts to the University of California system. We can rescind the fee increases at community colleges. It used to be that everybody had the right to an education. You didn't have to pay fees or tuition if you were a California state resident. Now there have been $9 million in fee increases, $91 million rather, at the community college level, $101 million at the level of the California state universities, the CSUs, and $190 million at the level of the University of California system. Okay, we can do all of that. But we could also restore the $3.5 million cut to food stamp benefits. And we could restore the $164.8 million in cuts to child care. I mean, I apologize. I get very angry when I look at what has happened in California. And, you know, I live and I work in California. As a matter of fact, I am the chair of the Women's Studies departments and have been reluctantly involved in the implementation of budget cuts. Education is under siege. But I can tell you that I've also taught in the San Francisco County jail system. And I've heard prisoners wonder aloud. Young black women wonder aloud why they could not get the kind of education that I and others tried to impart to them when they lived in the free world. Maybe, they said, just maybe they would have ended up as teachers or lawyers or auto workers or construction workers, not as prisoners disappeared from society, relegated to the state of civil death. It seems to me that our responsibility as concerned citizens is to fight for equal access to education. When the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that separate education was inherently unequal, they referred to racial segregation by law. Although racial segregation by law has been abolished, the practice of racial segregation and class segregation persists. This segregation can be most clearly perceived in the fact that race and class do matter when it comes to determining who gets to go to quality schools, where the love of knowledge is encouraged, and who gets to go to schools where the priority is what is called safety and security, that is to say, metal detectors instead of computers. That is to say, armed guards patrolling the hallways instead of committed mentors. These schools prepare children for juvenile detention, for incarceration in jails, and for incarceration in prisons. But we can begin to change this dismal situation. We can, I think, deepen the legacy of Brown. We can defend the civil rights of those whose punishment consists of the deprivation of rights and thus of conditions that can never prepare a person to engage in the practice of freedom. We can teach and defend the right to learn. We can make the clarion call for education, not incarceration. Thank you.
Angela Davis, Education, Not Incarceration is a co-production of TPT's Minnesota channel and the Givens Foundation for African American Literature. Sponsorship to Givens for this production provided by the Minneapolis Foundation.